Are you tired of being told what to think and how to act? Well, you are not alone. In case you haven't realized it, you have an internal GPS. It knows all you need to know about how to live your life. So it's about time you stopped letting the media and the government tell you what is true for you. In fact, it is exactly that time. It's time to think for yourself. And here to make sure you're doing just that is your host, mediator, author, and lawyer, Carol Gold.
Hi, it's Monday, November 25th. I'm Carol Gold, and welcome to Think for Yourself. I saw an interesting quote this week. Actually, it was a tweet by Vivek Ramaswamy on X, and I'm going to read it to you because it is the underpinning for the entire podcast episode. Here's what he tweeted. The Treasury Department maintains a, quote, do not pay list, end quote, that agencies are supposed to check before sending out money. So this list screens for death, it screens for delinquent federal debt, it screens for contractors who are excluded, okay, who should not receive money. But it doesn't really work that way. For example, the Small Business Administration granted over 100,000 forgivable loans to individuals who were on the DNP list. That resulted in $5.3 billion in payments to recipients who may have been ineligible for federal support. The SBA, the Small Business Association's Inspector General, recognized this and recommended the agency stop this, but the agency's current leadership rejected the proposal. This kind of flagrant waste needs to end. Time for at Doge, end quote. Okay, so what's he saying? Number one, he's saying that there are people receiving federal money, meaning your tax dollars, my tax dollars, who shouldn't be receiving it for a variety of reasons. Either they're dead or they're delinquent contractors with the government. There are many reasons why, but the point is they're still getting the money. And the other point he's making is that obviously either one branch of government or one agency doesn't communicate with the other, or this wouldn't happen. But more likely, he's making the point in the end that the SBA Inspector General tried to get this to stop, and he couldn't. So you have to ask yourself, is this really how government works? So let me share with you a couple of personal stories. Back in the 1970s, giving away my age to some degree, back in the 1970s, I worked on the mayoral campaign in the city of Philadelphia for then William Green, who ran for mayor. And I was first on his finance committee during the election. Once elected to the position of mayor, I was appointed to the revenue department. I worked in a delinquent tax section. So the delinquent tax section was the section that, as it's named, collected delinquent taxes from taxpayers in Philadelphia who weren't paying. On my, probably first week or second week on the job, I came in one morning and opened my desk drawer, and in it was a typed up list. And the title of the list was, Do Not Tax. Do Not Tax. And I looked down this list, and the first name I see are the Miller brothers, who at the time owned Yellow Cab in Philadelphia, the largest taxi company in Philadelphia. They were multimillionaires, and they were not to be taxed. City tax. And I saw many, many names on that list, some of which I knew, most of which I didn't. But I realized that these people were somehow being excluded from being taxed or forgiven from being taxed by the outgoing administration. And so the first thing I did was I went up to my superior, who at the time was the Department of Revenue, the head of the Department of Revenue, chairman of the Department of Revenue. And I told him what I had found, and I brought the list, and he said, don't worry, I'll take care of it. And then nothing happened. And so I started asking around, and when I mentioned what I had found and that he was going to handle it, people began to laugh at me who had been in government for a while and said, he was in the last administration. He knew this was going on. He's not going to fix anything. He's been promoted in this administration. So I said, okay, to myself, I can go over and above that. I was on the mayor's campaign. I know the chief of staff. I'll go talk to the chief of staff. So I made an appointment with the mayor's chief of staff, and I took him the list, And I told him what I had found, and I told him I had gone to the commissioner, the head of the Department of Revenue. And he said, "Don't worry, I'll take care of it. Thank you so much for bringing this to our attention." And they did take care of it. 2 days later, I came into work. My desk was gone. My chair was gone. And when I asked where it was, I was directed to a closet where my desk had been moved, and my phone was on my desk, but the wire wasn't connected to the wall. And I sat there for several days doing absolutely nothing. And then I went to see the largest Democratic contributor in the country at that time, who was a personal friend of my family. And he was a private sector businessman who was the largest Democratic donor in the United States. And I sat down with him and I told him exactly everything I had just told you. And he said to me, "Carol, I don't know why you'd want to work for government. Government punishes productivity. The private sector rewards it." That's story number one. Story number two is that a few years later, I and two friends of mine, both of whom were professionals, as was I, founded a political action committee, a pro-Israel political action committee. And we would go to Washington and we would meet with congressmen and senators and put before them issues that were of importance to both the United States and Israel. And I was sitting in Congressman Ron Wyden's office, who at the time was a freshman congressman. He's now a U.S. Senator. And after discussing what I had to discuss with him, as I was getting up to leave, he said to me, "So when are you going to run?" And I said, "For what?" And he said, "Political office in Pennsylvania," which is where I lived at the time. And I said, "I never really thought about it." And he said, "Well, when you're ready to run, the party will support you." And I left there stunned. Absolutely. Of course, my ego was off the charts, and I was stunned. So when I got back to Philadelphia, I called my father, whose opinion I respected. I asked him to meet with me for lunch. And I told him what then Congressman Wyden had said to me. And I said, "Dad, what should I do? Should I run? Should I run for Congress in Philadelphia, in Pennsylvania?" And he said, "When you're independently wealthy and you don't need the salary and you don't need the perks and you don't need the dinners and you don't need the trips abroad, yes, you can run for Congress. Until then, absolutely not. Because if you need the salary and you're impressed with the trips and the dinners and the perks, they own you. That's how it works." It was very wise advice. The third story I want to share with you is that because of the political action committee I had founded and because of the access it gave me and my co-founders, I was frequently sitting in the offices of U.S. congressmen and U.S. senators discussing U.S.-Israel issues. On one of those trips, as I was leaving to go to Washington, a friend of mine who was originally from Chicago but now lived in Philadelphia said to me, "If you're going to be in Washington and you know anybody that might have any pull in Illinois, in Chicago, my brother was in an accident. A bus, a public bus in Chicago, hit him. He had serious injuries, critical injuries, and there's been absolutely no legal action taken against the bus driver who hit him. He was crossing the street and the bus hit him. No legal action against the bus company, the city company, or the bus driver." I happened to, on that trip, have had a meeting with then Congressman, later Senator Paul Simon from Illinois. And before I left his office, I said to him, "Congressman," and I shared the story with him that I just shared with you. And I said, "If there's anything you could possibly do to look into this, it just seems like something's very wrong." Within a week, the bus driver was arrested and the city prosecuted that case. When I had that experience and combined it with the other experiences I just shared with you, I realized both the degree to which there is corruption in government, but also the degree to which access gives you a different level of justice, different exposure to justice and its outcomes and its prosecution. And so we have exponentially that kind of corruption at the federal level because it has been going on for a very long time. And the reason that you know they don't want it to stop is that every Republican nominee that Donald Trump will make that will need to be confirmed under the advise and consent clause of the Senate, well, of the Constitution, but the advise and consent function of the Senate, every one of them will be vehemently opposed. Why? Not because they're the Republican Party's nominees, not because it's a new president and a new party and therefore automatically oppose his potential cabinet members. No. They will oppose them because if you look at this crew of nominees that Trump has come up with, for the most part, they are not part of that political agenda that has perpetuated the corruption in Washington, certainly as long as I've been alive, and longer than that. And so that will be the reason that the opposition exists to Robert F. Kennedy Jr., to Tulsi Gabbard, to Hespeth, I think that's his name, I never get the pronunciation right, and to some of the others, certainly, and to Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy being involved in government. That will be the reason. It's because they actually can turn this tide, and they actually may be able to make a dent in the density of corruption that has become our federal government. How'd they get away with it for so long? How did it get so entrenched? Well, they kept us distracted. How did they do that? Well, we're a consumer society. If you get Netflix and Amazon delivers your stuff and you have food, we're pretty satisfied. We're not looking beyond that. We have been distracted by those things. And while we've been distracted, those things have exponentially grown. You know, decades ago, I was in the Soviet Union. Not Russia. I was there when it was the Soviet Union. And I was incredibly both impressed and depressed by the conditions there. Moscow was gray. It was depressing. The air was gray. The people were gray. Their clothing was gray. It was a very depressing place, the Soviet Union. Very oppressive as well. There were shortages of food. There were shortages of everything. Electricity was sporadic. You could tell there was oppression. You could tell there was fear. People would ask me questions by whispering, standing next to me in the street. And how much were your jeans? Do you want to sell your jeans? I mean, these things actually happened. But I think the most startling thing was that the Bolshoi Ballet, in order to get in to see the Bolshoi, it was 25 cents. That was the cost of entry to the Bolshoi. Why? Because the Bolshoi was beautiful and magical, and it was an escape for the population. And so keeping them distracted from the oppression and the fear and the corruption in their own world was a high priority for the Soviet Union. That's Netflix, that's Amazon, that's all the materialism. And quite honestly, it's most of the technology. We are distracted, and therefore we have neither the time nor the energy nor the desire particularly which has been worn thin in us, to care about deeper issues, to care about who our political leaders are, to care about how they behave. You know, I listened to Glenn Greenwald, the journalist, one of the few good ones around. I listened to him recently in an interview, and he was saying that most of what we get through the media is government-directed propaganda, and he gave firsthand examples of why this is true and how you know that that's what's going on. But he also raised the question, why are all of the documents and information related to JFK's assassination still concealed? Why is all the information relating to 9/11 still concealed? Why is all the information relating to UFOs and their existence or their potential existence concealed? It's because knowledge is power. And if you know the truth, if there's something in the 9/11 documents and information that indicates the version we got of what happened isn't the whole picture or even a true picture, and the same is true about the JFK assassination or UFOs, then we become empowered instead of blind. And when you're blind, you go through life groping, right? Because you can't see. You can't see what's in front of you. and we have stopped seeing what's in front of us because we've been distracted. We have to not stand for the corruption. We have to not stand for the concealment. We have a right to know. They are public servants. That's what they're called. They have no right to keep from us information that they gather, that we pay them to gather, and that we have a right to know. You know, the first time I went to Israel, what became incredibly clear to me was the joy and the aliveness of the population, generally speaking. It was one of the most vibrant environments I had ever been in. And I couldn't figure out. It felt so vibrant and so different from life here in the United States that I almost felt like back home here in the United States, I was living in a movie set where if you looked behind the cardboard or the wood, there was nothing back there. It was just a movie set in the front and, wood holding up the front in the back, and that there wasn't really anything there. But in Israel, everything felt full of life and passion and real. And I realized that it's because they live every single day with the prospect of death. And when you live every single day with the prospect of death, which they do in Israel because they are surrounded by hundreds of millions of antagonistic Arabs, when you live with that, when you live with the potential for death every day, it gives you a profound awareness of the value of life and the joy of being alive. There's a lesson there for us, and the lesson is this. We should live every day of our lives with the prospect of how us participating in or allowing corruption. And I say participating in because we have to not do it in our own lives. We have to not cheat in our own lives. We have to not lie in our own lives. Because when we make that the standard, and enough of us make that the standard, not little things we excuse ourselves for. I mean, not do it, period, ever, on the smallest scale, on the microcosmic level. Be honest. Be honest with ourselves. Be honest with the people we interact with every day. When we do that, that leads to the end of corruption, because it leads to the end of leaders who rise to a level who think they can participate in corruption and concealment because they know it is not the underpinnings of the culture, but it has become the underpinnings of our culture. So ultimately, like the Israelis' prospect daily of the potential for loss of life makes them acutely aware of the value and joy in life, so too the awareness on our part in our daily lives that participating in corruption in our own lives or deception in our own lives leads to having leaders who do the same thing. And therefore, we should live every day not with an acute awareness of death, but an acute awareness that we could lose our freedoms. I think if we got up every day and thought, I could be enslaved very quickly unless I have a really high level of integrity in my own life. And if we got up every day and really internalized that, we as individuals would be much more careful about our truth-telling, about skirting the law when we can, no matter how small that may be, because collectively we truly do create the construct, create the paradigm, create the reality in which we live. Everything has a tipping point. And so we need to get to a point where it would be impossible to have leaders who were corrupt and who were deceptive. That tipping point can only happen when you and I and enough of us make that the standard that we live by every day. When that happens, we will have leaders who reflect that. We've had leaders who reflect the opposite. We need to own that reflection. And we need to give Donald Trump and this cabinet that he's putting together and these people in important positions that he is putting together a chance to right this ship and move us once again in the direction that the founders set us off upon when they drafted the Constitution. Thanks for listening. I'm Carol Gold. I'll be back here again next week, and until I am, by all means, think for yourself.
Carol thanks you for spending your valuable time with her. It is her mission to empower you to remember how smart and capable you are. Be sure to check out Carol's website, carolgold.com. That's Carol with an E, gold.com. Please leave a review and subscribe here so you'll be alerted to Carol's next podcast. Until then, above all else, remember, it's time to think for yourself.